Hey everybody, Ryan here from Cold Harbor Supply, and today we are doing another tube comparison video, and this one is going to be the big one. We're going to be comparing all the tubes we have because a question we do get asked a lot here is how does XYZ tube perform against another XYZ tube? Some of these tests will be more of a laboratory test, so we're going to put these guys on the Hoffman, do a gain test and a resolution test with them, and some of them will be more real-world testing, so we'll take this out to different lighting conditions going from urban usage all the way to super low light usage in an interior environment to see how they stack up against each other. It's going to be really hard to fit all of our tube variations on the same screens. We're going to be putting the cheapest tube against the second most affordable and then going forward from there. And at the end, I'm going to see what kind of movie magic I can do to try to get as much of a comparison as possible. Now, full disclosure for some of our testing conditions. Of course, this is not a be-all, end-all test. This is the best I can do. If I were going to sit and try to compare every single tube that we have in inventory with all the different kinds of specs that we have, I'd probably be sitting here for the entire day. But we're going to be taking a very good representation of each grade of tube that we carry and then comparing them in our following tests. We're selecting pretty high performance tubes in each category. They're also going to have decent cosmetics, so you can really see what the best in each category has to offer. All of the tubes are going to be put into monocular housings. They're all going to be using the same lens combination, which is going to be a Noctis Technologies front and rear lens, so US mil-spec lenses, to reduce any abnormalities or any variabilities with different kinds of glass. You can kind of expect all those conditions to be the same. We're going to be filming all of these tests on our A7S III. Now, this is an A7 IV because the A7S III is being used to film right now, but it looks the same. It just has a bit better low light performance, and we're going to be using all the same camera settings throughout the entire range of tests, and that is going to be posted probably on the bottom right over here somewhere, so that way you guys can refer to that later. The specs of each tube will be posted inside the test pictures, so you'll be able to see them with the specs listed. That way you can always refer to them when you need to. And we are going to be doing both a true color version of the test as well as a monochromatic version of the test where I just remove all the saturation in the image, because sometimes it's easier to tell the differences of performance between tubes when they are black and white. So without further ado, let's get started. The first test we're going to do is going to be the Hoffman test, which, as you may have seen in our videos, is like an eye test for your nods. As the light levels drop in the Hoffman machine, you can see how the tubes render fine details such as these line pairs. We suggest viewers rewind, pause, and review any parts of the videos that they want to see in more detail. This isn't just an edutainment video. We actually want you guys to use this as a bit of a guide, so that way you can select the tube that works best for your requirements and budget. If you look at the specs of all these devices, a lot of the specs are relatively similar. The largest difference in spec, in my opinion, is going to be the SNR spec, which is the signal to noise ratio. Most people consider this spec to be the most important spec in determining what tube to get for ground-based night vision usage. As the light level drops in the Hoffman, and the Hoffman is a great way to tell this because it outputs a very fixed amount of light in a very controlled setting, you will see the noise of the night vision device increase because there are less photons to intensify. So as a general rule of thumb for most new users, I suggest looking for cosmetics, how clean the tube is, if these will bother you in use, and then looking at the SNR spec, which will determine how much noise you get when the image gets extremely dark. Moving on from our more budget-oriented NNVT tubes to our more premium echo tubes, you start to notice a larger decrease in noise levels again, and you will also start to notice an increase in contrast. So the difference between light and darks will be more pronounced, and in my opinion, it's a very important thing to generating a very rich and deep image, and it allows you to see depth a lot better. So if you can't afford the difference between NNVTs and even the basic echo tubes, not only will you see a slight jump in specs, but the image does render slightly differently, and if I were to put this in layman's terms, it would be like switching from an LCD monitor to an OLED monitor. Even though the resolutions, specs, and all that stuff may be similar, the way they render the image is a bit different, and in my opinion, the Photonis renders an image with a bit more depth because it has that contrast advantage over NNVT. Moving on to our more higher end performing tubes such as the Echo Plus and eventually the 4G high gains, you will start to notice a pretty dramatic decrease in the levels of noise and an increase in the sharpness of the fine details because of that. While the difference in Echo and Echo Plus might not be in the other specs such as gain or resolution, the Echo Plus has a huge SNR advantage, which allows you to see finer details much sharper at lower light levels because you don't have that noise in the way. So for users looking for that kind of economy plus option, to put it in layman's terms, the Echo Plus represents a wonderful tube that brings you similar performance characteristics of the Echo with all the Photonis advantages that we're going to get into later, like ultra-fast autogating, great highlight performance, but with just a higher spec threshold. Some of the biggest differences in this tube comparison are going to be the jump to the Photonis high gain tubes. Not only do they have high FOMs, which simply, if I did not mention earlier, is going to be your SNR multiplied by your resolution, they also have gain values that are almost triple that of Echo tubes and NNVT tubes. Due to the combination of those specs, they can render the same image, if not better, at lower light levels. So as you can see here, as we decrease the light levels in the Hoffman, you'll notice that the Photonis 4G high gain produces a sharp image that's also brighter. So with the Photonis 4G high gains, you'll actually notice that the FOM is very slightly lower than the Echo Plus, but it is producing a much more usable image. In this case, the line pairs on the 5s are actually still visible, whereas on the Echoes they're almost all gone. And this continues into the extreme low light levels of the Hoffman as well. So if you're willing to pay for this level of performance, the Photonis 4G high gains are going to be the tube for you. As a bit of a fun experiment, we're going to be comparing at the end of all these tests the NNVT4 starter nod, the non-autogated version, with our highest end tube, which is going to be the Photonis 4G high gain, just to show you what the discrepancy in performance is. And I believe that a lot of people are actually going to take these results and put their own kind of spin on them. For some people, the discrepancy is going to be very large, and for others, the discrepancy might not be as big as you think. And like we like to say here at CHS, there's going to be a night vision device for everyone. Again, if you do value performance, obviously the Photonis 4G high gain is going to blow the NNVT4 out of the water. However, it is also a lot more expensive. So it really depends on what you're willing to pay for and the performance standards you are able to tolerate. So there you have it. Those are going to be the lab test results, and the results were quite interesting. Let's take these out to the real world and see how well they do in real life environments, starting with a highlight test. So we tested these devices in a suburban environment, driving the car and a person holding the nod rig out. So you're going to see some shakes in the camera, but you get to see this in some vehicular use in what I would consider to be a pretty realistic environment. As you can notice, all of our tubes will have very small halos. That's just a benefit of using hybrid multi-alkali tubes over gallium arsenide tubes. But what you will notice with the NNVT4 autogated tubes, and I like to point this out sometimes with the NNVT4's autogating, is that the autogating pulse is slower than the Echo autogating pulse. It's not that perceptible to the human eye in this environment, but in some environments that we've shown earlier in past videos, you can very much see the pulsing of LEDs when they don't match the frequency of the NNVT4's slower autogating pulse for their autogating tubes. So if you do find yourself using it in a lot of mixed lighting environments and you don't want that autogating pulse and you don't want to spend a lot of money, sometimes going with the NNVT4 non-autogated tubes can provide you a little bit better of a user experience. This isn't so much of a problem for Photonis tubes because they autogate at a much faster frequency than NNVTs, so those results are usually going to be minimized. One thing that you might notice with some of the Photonis tubes is you see these interesting flare artifacts coming off the lights. Now, this isn't a defect of the tube. This simply is because Photonis Echoes use a slightly different technology than NNVT tubes from. For my research, they see a bit of a wider band of the electromagnetic spectrum, So it focuses these different areas of lights a little bit differently than NNVT. This does allow Photonis to gather a wider band of light so it can see things like out-of-band lasers. It can also work better in low-light environments because it has a broader spectrum. However, if you guys are looking at point light sources, sometimes they can have these slight flaring elements to them. I don't actually find it too distracting, but it is something that I want you guys to note. It is a side effect of the wider band of light that echoes and 4Gs can see. So here we're going to be comparing the NNVT4 starter nod to the 4G high gain. So it's a pretty huge difference in performance. And you will see some of that difference with the sharpness of distant objects. It's going to be a lot better on the 4G. But again, with the Photonis 4G high gains, you are paying more. And you do get some of those interesting flare elements. I don't actually find them that distracting. And I do like the additional sharpness that the 4G high gains provide. But here the difference is going to be pretty minimal because it is so bright. So in this part of the test, I didn't compare all the tubes because I didn't want to look at the characteristics of the tubes. I simply want to look at the autogating characteristics of each tube and how they perform. The way that all of the Photonis tubes autogate from Echo Plus to 4G is relatively similar, if not the same. You will notice in this case in front of this storefront, the NNVT4 autogated tubes actually have a little bit of trouble rendering the frequencies of the LEDs. This is because there's a huge mismatch between the autogating refresh rate of the tube versus the refresh rate of the LEDs, because most dimmable LEDs now, they don't actually dim, they just pulse in order to control the brightness. So when that happens, you might have a lot of really distracting visual artifacts. And in some of these cases, a non-autogated tube, such as the CHS starter PVS14, may work better because it has what's called BSP in lieu of autogating. So it only relies on bright source protection, which lowers the voltage of the photocathode of the tube to protect itself against bright light. So autogating, and I've said this a million times, is not the only way a tube can protect itself against bright light. It's simply one of the ways, and many autogated tubes combine both autogating and BSP to get the best image possible. The Echo sits in the middle of this. It doesn't have the haziness that happens with BSP because the outcome of BSP is that it lowers the resolution of the tube quite a lot, but the Echo also doesn't have as much pulsing as the NNVT4 autogated because the Echo has very fast autogating frequencies. It autogates faster than any other tube on the market, so you get a little bit less of that effect versus the NNVT4 autogated tube. So muzzle flashes are likely going to be the most dynamic and bright light sources that most night vision users will encounter in their usage. I just wanted to show you guys that just because the NNVT4 starter nods are not autogated doesn't mean they don't turn off or protect themselves against this bright light source. However, it does so at a little bit of a lower frequency than the Photonis Echoes do, and the NNVT4 AG sits somewhere in the middle of this. As we bring the footage up to real-time speed, you may notice this actually doesn't make as big of a difference as you think, unless you're one of those people with access to full auto, in which case you're probably getting autogated tubes anyways. So we're out here in the woods yet again, far away from Toronto, so that way we're not affected too much by light pollution because we're in a more rural area. And I have my camera here if you can see it, and we got a little monitor here to help us focus to make sure that all of our footage is nice and tack sharp. It is a full moon today, and there aren't too many clouds in the sky, but we are in a very well canopied forest. Now, these aren't going to be the most difficult conditions for these nods, but we're going to show harder conditions as we go on through the video, and you will also see these in an indoor environment where the lighting variables are going to be a lot more controlled. So let's get into the results. So in this outdoor test, we're going to be starting with the easiest outdoor conditions and then moving on to harder ones as we progress through them. We are also going to be transitioning some of these tests, as I mentioned earlier in the video, to black and white, so that way you can tell the differences between the footage, because sometimes it's easier to tell the differences when the image is monochromatic. For our first test, we're going to be putting the camera rig with the nod on a riverbank and looking down at the river, which is a nice moving kind of target in terms of detail to see how well the nods can resolve these fine details. And you might notice as you go up, even in these high light levels, the noise levels do make a difference to the detail that you can observe. What I want you guys to see is how well can the nods resolve something like this flowing river. The river isn't very deep. In fact, you might even miss it with some lower spec nods. while the higher spec nods, you can actually see the individual ripples very easily because they are not taken over by the noise level. Going into the Photonis tubes over the NNVT, again, here's where the contrast comes into a really nice play. What I noticed with the Photonis tubes over the NNVT tubes is the things like the rocks and where the riverbed ends, the differentiation between the layers of the trees is a lot more apparent. Even though the tubes have similar gain values, the way that they render the image is quite different. Moving into the Echo Plus tubes and the 4G tubes, one thing that I noticed over the other tubes is the river becomes a lot more apparent. The details in the water, such as the ripples and everything like that, the movement is a lot easier to see. So if you are navigating difficult terrain, sometimes that little bit of extra spec can actually make you miss some hazards and give you more context as to how you should navigate. In the case of the 4G tube, it absolutely eclipses the Echo tube. It amplifies light just a lot more, and the image is just crazy bright in comparison. As well, the details on the river become extremely apparent, with even the small rapids on the bottom part of the river being very visible. When comparing the extremes of the performance spectrum, our highest performing tube to our starter tube, you can see a huge difference in where the river flows. With the starter tube, I find it a little bit hard to even know there's a river there, and with the high-end tube, I can actually see into the river and the details of the ripples and the waves on the water. Our next test is going to bring us into a decently canopied part of the woods, again with the same full moon night and with not much cloud cover. So again, not the hardest conditions for the nods to work through, but even here we can see the differences in the performance of each night vision device. The more entry-level devices are obviously going to be more noisy, but that noise doesn't actually limit you from seeing the cameraman walk between the trees. What that noise and less detail will limit you from is the rendition of the fine details between the trees and the ground where the forest is darkest. Some of these details can be lost to the noise, so if you're navigating in a forest with night vision devices, having a higher gain device will allow you to see the ground a little bit better. I know you shouldn't be looking at the ground when you're walking, but if there are hazards there, those details may be lost in the noise of more entry-level tubes, whereas the higher-end tubes will be able to pick out these fine details and differences in terrain a little bit better so that you can avoid them. As we move on to our higher spec performing tubes, you will notice the ground literally start to open up with detail in front of you, and you'll notice more contrast and definition between the layers of the trees. When we move on to 4Gs, that increases tenfold, and as you can see here, the 4Gs are outperforming even the very strong spec Echo Plus tubes. This difference between the SNR levels and gain levels is made more apparent when we compare the NNVT4 Non Autogated entry tube to the 4G high gain. With the NNVT tube, I don't even know that there's anything in front of the trees on the ground. It kind of looks just like a big noisy blob. Yes, I know that's the ground, but with the high gain tubes, you can actually see a lot more of the details in the ground. So if there's something like a root in the way, that's something that you might not be able to see with the NNVT4s, but you will see that with the high gain tubes. Conversely, does the lower spec tubes prevent me from seeing or navigating this environment at all? Obviously not. This environment would still be very easy to navigate even with entry-level night vision tubes. In this last round of outdoor testing, we brought the nods into an even more heavily canopied environment, and while there was still a full moon, the moon actually was not even crested above this hill on the right, so it is a pretty dark space, and here the noise differences become very apparent. Even between the NNVT4 Non Autogated tube and the NNVT4AG, there is about a difference of 4 between the SNR levels, and you can see this is actually a pretty apparent difference in real-life use. With the NNVT4AG, I can actually see the difference between the path and the bushes on the side, whereas with the NNVT4, it does become a little bit more of a blurry mess, but again, still very, very usable. The Photonis tubes in this case do even better. With the lower noise levels, you see much more details, you see much more of a contrast and difference between the path and the trees on the side, and you can start to see where there's kinds of different layers of shrubbery around the forest. One thing I want you to note, while the gain value on the 4AG is higher, the Echo does produce a more usable image. So what I suggest is don't look at specs in a vacuum, guys. Make sure that you are looking at the tube holistically. Between the Echo and the Echo Plus, again, a same level of difference. With the Echo Plus, the path and the shrubs on the side are becoming much, much more defined. You can start to see sharpness in the branches in the back of the image where they don't just look like kind of these darker streaks. It actually looks like proper branches, and the lower level of noise does allow you to see a little bit more detail. Does this level of noise on the Echo make the image unusable? Absolutely not, but with the Echo Plus, you are seeing a little bit more. And in these extreme low light levels, this is where the 4G high gains start to shine. The image for the 4G high gains in this lower light level almost look like the previous test that we did, even though the light levels are dramatically lower. So what that higher gain value allows you to do is allows you to get more image in more extreme environments. So that's why they're high gain tubes, and that's why they demand the price tag that they do. They do allow you to see more in a larger threshold of environments than standard Echoes and NNVT tubes. And of course, comparing the NNVT4 starter tube to the 4G high gain, it's not really much of a contest here. The 4G high gain is going to be better in every conceivable way except for cost in these more extreme environments. But again, the NNVT tube is not unusable. I could still navigate with the NNVT4 Non Autogated tube in this low light environment. The 4G high gain tube simply makes that a lot easier, and I can see more without having to use things like supplemental illumination. Now on to some indoor tests. This is a stairwell in a basement that we were allowed to film in, and we're comparing the tubes against each other in very, very dark environments. The only light here is the little bit of outside light from, I believe, a door in the next room over. Noise levels are going to make a pretty huge difference in determining your environment in this case. With the more basic NNVT tubes, you can still see the fine details. However, I do find it hard to see where the door frame kind of ends, where it goes into that, I believe that's a freezer down there. That kind of melds into the door for the lower spec tubes. But for the higher spec tubes, I can see there's a clear break and differentiation between that door and the next room over. Another thing I want our viewers to have a look at is the space on the right-hand side of the image where there's a bit of a shoe rack situation going on. With the higher spec tubes, it's easier to tell what's there. With the lower spec tubes, it's going to be a little bit harder to tell that there's anything there at all, or if there's a blob there, or if there's a person there. With the higher spec tubes, it's just a little bit easier to see into those very, very dark areas. The last and possibly most important thing I want you guys to have a look at is the items in the counter in the far end of the image in the center. This could be important if you're doing some SSC or some evidence collecting things at night. With lower spec tubes, you're going to have a bit more of a detection range versus identification range thing going on. So with lower end tubes, you're going to see that there's something there. With higher end tubes, you can probably tell roughly what it is based on the shape of it because there will be more detail that the tube's spitting out for you to render. And again, in these indoor super low light environments, here is going to be where things like the Echo Plus and the 4G high gains shine the most, as they do have the highest spec and you can see the most details. Especially for the 4G. The 4G can pretty much see everything in the room and everything on the right-hand side of the image, no problem, whereas the other tubes are going to struggle a little bit without supplemental illumination. And of course, as a fun little experiment, we're comparing the 4 starter nod to the 4G high gain, and here, in this very low light environment, there is a pretty stark difference in image quality between the two, but yet again, it's still usable. It's still very, very usable. You're not blind with a lower spec tube. You simply don't see as much than a higher spec tube. So in our final comparison for real life scenarios, we're going to be putting all of these tubes in a warehouse closet where we can control the light. The only light source in this case is going to be from a tiny marking glow stick that we put in the rafters of this room. So it's barely any light, just enough for the night vision to intensify, because even though nods are magic, they still need a little bit of light to work. They will not work in absolutely pitch dark conditions. We also made sure to use an external monitor to focus this and to turn the monitor and the onboard camera monitor off, because in these extreme cases, even that little bit of light coming off of a camera monitor or a viewfinder can actually really skew the results. So in these extreme low light conditions, what I find is when you go up in spec with tubes, you just gain a little bit more definition, again, because of the lower noise levels. All of these tubes have very similar gain levels, so what the noise allows you to do is take advantage of those gain levels so that you can see a little bit more, so that the image doesn't get lost in the scintillation or noise of the tube, struggling to collect as many photons as it can. What's interesting to me is the movement from Echo to Echo Plus actually does have a bit more of a difference than I anticipated. With the Echo Plus tube, I'm able to see a little bit more of the tops of the shelves, the bottom of the shelves, and I'm able to see the items on the shelves a lot easier than I would with the Echo. So yes, even though the Echo Plus has similar gain levels to an Echo tube, that boost in SNR does make a difference in extreme low light conditions. To continue the trend, moving to 4G high gain is where you're going to see the largest difference when it comes to ultra low light performance. I would say the Echo Plus here is completely outclassed by the 4G high gain, with the 4G high gain clearly rendering everything on the shelf in detail as well as the surrounding walls with good fidelity. So if you do have the cash to spare, the 4G high gain is going to give you that little bit of extra oomph in basically no light conditions. Of course, when we compare the NNVT4 starter tube to the 4G high gain, there's really no comparison to be made here. I would actually say that this is a massive, massive difference in performance, as you can clearly see. With the NNVT4 Non Autogated tubes, you can barely see anything versus the clear image on the 4G high gain. Now, could I still navigate this room and tell there's things inside? Yes, but any clear detection would be close to impossible with this spec discrepancy. So we just came back from that round of testing, and it's the next day, and we hope that that amount of testing and all these conditions showed how these tubes performed in a variety of different environments. In some environments, the differences were extremely stark, and in some of them, they weren't as big as perhaps the internet says they are. We made this video in order to show the differences between all of our tubes. Sometimes it can be hard to explain in person, and a spec sheet can only tell you so much. Sometimes looking at it in actual real-world conditions is going to tell you how well Tube A compares to Tube B. A huge deciding factor is not just going to be performance, but it's also going to be the price of the tube. So the reason why we carry so many different devices, all the way from budget devices to super high-end devices, is because we do believe there is a nod out there for everyone. And I do think online especially, there's a little bit of gatekeeping for people only wanting the, 2200 plus FOM, 3000 FOM tubes. The best night vision is obviously going to be the one that you have. So if you could only afford a more modestly performing tube, it can still see in the dark and still do fairly well. However, if you can squeeze a larger budget for your intensifier, you will see some significant differences in performance, especially when the lights get very, very dim. In talking about price, I want to mention that the night vision device and the intensifier is only one part of a complete night vision setup. When we talk about night vision here at CHS, we don't just mean the night vision device itself. You're probably not going to want to just hold this to your eye and walk around in the forest fumbling around with that thing. So getting a nice mount, nice helmet, ear pro, all that important stuff to make sure that this thing is mounted and working. Additionally, if you want to have a little bit more fun with your night vision, you probably want to consider what stuff you want to put on your firearms, airsoft guns, whatever, in order for you to be able to use them effectively at night. So stuff like an optic, and I know this isn't a night vision compatible optic, but stuff like an optic, lasers, IR lights, and things like that, they can all factor into the overall cost of your setup. If you got a really good performing tube, but you don't have an IR light for your rifle, you're probably going to get bested by someone with a more modestly performing tube with an IR light because they have more flexibility in varying conditions. And I know that's not the ending that a lot of people are going for. They probably want me to select, what is the best tube that I would pick? Of course, that's really going to depend on the conditions you're using this, as you've seen earlier, and also the budget that you have. So here at Cold Harbor, we do offer a huge range of selection of tubes for what we consider most lines of performance out there and all kinds of budget. And of course, if you need any help further beyond this video, give us a call, give us an email, and we're happy to consult with you on what might fit best for you. And with that, thanks for watching, everybody. That was a doozy of a video to edit and to do, and we will see you on the next one.